believers, non-believers, unaffiliated believers, sort of believers, and even you think I'm a believers, welcome. My non-university unstudents, welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor. I'm delighted that you've downloaded my U show today. When I was in elementary school, my family lived on welfare. I don't remember ever me or my 3 siblings going hungry, but things were financially tight. It was a big deal when we could scrape enough money, gather enough coins together, and pile into the car and go to the drive-in theater. We had our own pre-popped popcorn in a big paper grocery bag. Back then I had a paper route when I was in the 5th grade to earn a few dollars. But still, I was a happy little blonde-haired, tie-dyed, t-shirt wearing boy. And for 4 of my elementary school years, my parents themselves attended college. Now that meant we lived in married housing on the college campus in rainy Western Oregon. The specific apartment complex was called Vets Village. It was, just as the name clarified, housing given over to veterans who were going back or going to college. My stepdad, Jerry, was a Navy veteran, so he and Mom qualified for veterans housing. And again, I don't remember particularly caring, but the apartments were Spartan. They were run down, simple. There were no exercise facilities. Goodness, there weren't even any garages. We had gravel driveways with sizable potholes. They were just crummy old apartments. What I do remember about that time in my life is that some of the kids at school got to wear Levi's blue jeans and Adidas. Adidas. Die Marke mit den 3 Streifen. Yeah, I still remember that phrase. Die Marke mit den 3 Streifen. Because that was the Adidas trademark. The brand with the 3 stripes. Oh, I was so enthralled with Adidas when I was a kid. They were simply magical. And one of my classmates, one of my buddies, Tony, had a pair of Adidas royal blue stripes. So cool. Tony also got to wear Levi's jeans. I think his dad was a medical doctor. But here at home, we 4 kids, we wore whatever jeans were on sale at JCPenney's or Kmart at back-to-school sales. So that meant I was not one of the cool kids. Oh, how I envied those kids that got to wear Adidas and Levi's. But wow, that's the power of perception, right? The power of the dominant culture. And we humans we crave to be one of the cool kids, to belong to the dominant culture. It's wonderful to feel accepted by the cool kids. You guys? The same is true along moral lines. Most of us, we desperately crave belonging to the ascendant, with it, fashionable, power-leveraging, future-shaping group. And that's all true even when the group's moral commitments run contrary to biblical framing. Folks, it's hardly news to you that America has undergone a massive cultural shift. What has driven that shift? Mostly it has been a shift about what is moral. Now, you know me. Today I'm not going to go into some screed about how sinful you are or yell and scream like my boyhood pastor did about the sins that you may be secretly committing. But I do want to think with you. America's moral shift has produced a climate where vandalism, looting, rioting, arson, and shootings. Oh, that poor boy Antonio Mays Jr. up in Chop, Washington, 16 years old. He and his 14-year-old friend. They were shot inside their Jeep Cherokee on June 29th, shot inside a Black Lives Matter zone supposedly established to champion black concerns. He was shot, Antonio, shot and dead. Antonio's dad was on TV pleading with the protesters to keep it peaceful. America's moral shift has brought us into a season where rioting, vandalism, arson, and shootings are not only being allowed to occur by mayors and governors and pastors, those crimes are being given moral cover, defended. Why? How? Because America has undergone a massive cultural shift, one driven by moral constructs. America has gone away from personal ethics to social ethics. We've moved beyond or around thinking about people in terms of personal responsibility. And now we can almost only think about morality as a social dynamic, a social concern or construct. The education of children used to involve classes about personal responsibility and morality. Today's education for kids involves how to put a condom on a banana or how evil the United States is. We used to value personal morality. Now we can almost exclusively talk about social morality. We used to talk about matters of the heart. Now we talk about what entire classes or what whole races of people do en masse. It's a poker tell. Their eyebrows twitching. How did we get here? Significantly, Marxist ideology. As I noted in my last episode on Marxism, you are your class. You are not your personal biography. You are your class. You're not your personal giftedness. You're your class. You're not the hurdles you have overcome in your own unique life. You are your class, your race. And that class-based or that racist group view of reality has now become dominant. It's why white Christians are told, you are a closet racist. Or, if you're silent, you're violent. Or, you are part of the systemic racism that afflicts our country. Well, all that's true provided you haven't already confessed that you're a racist. But again, in a Marxist worldview, you are your class. And supposedly, we are bombarded, supposedly entire classes of people are morally uniform, right? All blacks are good and noble, all whites are evil and racist. Wait, what? That's the nuance. That's the nuance of Marxist moral framing. And the collective consciousness of the country has thereby undergone an enormous shift from personal to social. Churches, oh goodness, churches have been swept up by the thousands into this too. My own denomination is trying to placate the Marxists with facile public statements. It is so childish to watch. Still, let's be clear. Is racism real? Of course. Is racism contrary to the heart of Christ? Sure, and what Christian would argue on behalf of racism? Should education teach American history that it involved slavery and the Civil War and racism? Absolutely yes. History, the truth of history is critical. But those aren't really the questions that are at issue today for the Marxists. No, the abiding question is whether systemic racism is real. That's the question. And that a huge percentage of the country does believe there is intentional systemic racism built into the nation's very existing fabric is the result of Marxist thought having been mainstreamed into education for some 60 years. True dat. Look, I want to be very clear with you because, oh goodness, because there are some who believe that my doing a series on this proves that I am in fact a white supremacist, a closet racist. Oh. It recalls a quote I've used several times before from Albert Mayles. Tyranny is the deliberate removal of nuance. I'm making some important nuance points in this series. Tyranny is the deliberate removal of nuance. I want to be clear with you what I'm doing here. Clarity. I'm not explaining all blacks or even black culture. Go back and listen to my earlier 2 episodes on the cult of the now. Not about blacks. In my understanding, this is about philosophic framing. And it's just not the case that most blacks are 21st century Marxists. Black Lives Matter, the organization, is. They are avowedly, proudly, openly, foundationally Marxist. Antifa foments anarchy from Marxist commitments. But are the nightly mobs in downtown Portland, Oregon all Marxist? I don't know. I mean, when I look at the pictures over and over, the video, there's probably more white people there in Antifa than blacks. But the way this is being spun, again by media, professors, politicians, and pastors, is that to disagree with the dominant narrative, all whites are closet racists, that is presented to us as a commitment through and through, and it stems from Marxism. Look at, a significant percentage of the black community is churched. I couldn't find a study in 2020, but blackdemographics.com in a 2007 study noted that 87% of blacks are affiliated with religion. Wikipedia reports the same, and they're both drawing on a Pew Research study back then. 87% affiliated with religion. I believe most blacks want what's best for themselves, their neighborhoods, their neighbors, the nation. So again, for me, this is not about the black community en masse. Geez, I have to pause and point out the nuance of what I'm saying. But the leaders, the media wanting to win back the levers of power for progressive Democrats are, yes, they are, neo-Marxists. The truth spinners in the halls of government, too many are neo-Marxists. The power brokers who reside behind the curtain like the wizard in The Wizard of Oz, they are committed, openly avowed Marxists. And this series, what I'm trying to do here is to reveal that ideology, that philosophy, and the effect that that ideology has had on the United States now as we find ourselves in 2020. And so I'm calling this series The Cult of the Now. Marxism is cultish. It's cultish because it's extremist. They're no longer trying to persuade the general public, they're threatening the public. It's cultish because it's ahistorical. They are intentionally rewriting the history books, removing anything good or noble or redemptive from American history. That ahistorical, that ahistorical gloss wants us all to believe America is exclusively evil. Cultish. It's cultish because it claims to have exclusive power to remedy a situation. If you don't get on your knee before our truth claims, we will cancel you. And it's cultish because it is so amazingly dominated by groupthink. If you don't confess your allegiance to the ever-morphing claims of the Marxist woke, toke, smoke crowd, you'll be canceled. Seriously? The NFL is willing to lose 40% of its American audience over the organization Black Lives Matter? Wow. Group thought. Seriously? J.K. Rowling is being canceled because she believes women are women and that girls should be allowed to participate in sporting contests that don't involve boys with their penises cut off. Wow. Groupthink. Conform or be canceled. By way of contrast, the Roman Catholic Church is, by design, diverse. That's pretty much the definition of Catholic, universal, the many around the one. There are churches that say the Catholic Mass in Latin, others that do so in the local vernacular, English, German. There are many different Catholic orders, each having been established by its own founder, with its own rules, with its own commitments to serve Christ and His gospel through different ways to reach out to the local community, feeding the poor, educating children, founding hospitals or foster homes or shelters for single moms, orphanages, profound diversity. Woke Marxism? Monolithic. You defy Marxist group thought, you will be canceled. It's very cultish. It's surreal to watch. But back to my point for today. The moral constructions in America have shifted dramatically away from personal responsibility and ethics to social and class responsibility and ethics. Let me tell you a story to make my point. About 9 years ago, I was teaching a midday section of Christian Worldview. It was a class designed to process reality from an identity given to Christ. And that week's ethical topic was human sexuality, and we were framing questions of human formation and sexuality in terms of personal responsibility, the way that the Bible does. And then someone raised his hand, asked a good question, and before you knew it, we were into a thoughtful class discussion. Sheesh, I so treasured those moments. Thinking together? Are you kidding me? What a concept! And then along the way, another student raised her hand and said, "But Rybarczyk, you're framing the matter as a personal one about our biology, our sex. This is really about power. For example, when a woman is raped, the deeper matter is not about her genitalia being touched or violated, but more about the fact that she suffered an abuse of power. A woman who has been raped needs professional counseling to help her work through the trauma she suffered by an abuse of power." Now, I heard that question, and I distinctly remember saying to the student, "But if she weren't being violated sexually, involving her sexual self, involving sexual touch, would she feel the same sense of betrayal that she did? Is it primarily about an abuse of power? Isn't her shame or her wound or her embarrassment, her violation related to her sex as a woman?" I was surprised because the student was sure. She said no. And she insisted it's a matter of power. It was power that wounded the woman. And I wondered if it was a psychological defense, if it was a shift, if that was a way to protect a woman from having to deal with the pain, the violation of sexual touch. But now I know that's not the case. Marxism construes all problems as a matter of power, group power, class power. A woman's violation isn't about sex, it's about power. And our problems, say the Marxists, have nothing to do with the shape of individual human hearts, nothing to do with how the moral compass of hundreds of millions of individual human hearts have been twisted with resulting cultural manifestations. No. Goodness, Marxism is so attractive because it's so simple. And it teaches there are entire races that are good, and there are entire races that are bad. And we can know who is positively good and positively bad by the color of their skin. It's so simple. It's so easy to grasp. But in truth, it's diabolical. And it's diabolical because it's a lie. Hey, the UU podcast is making a mark. Folks are resonating with the information and analysis and the theophilosophical framing of my work, and so I am sincerely appreciative. Today, a tip of me out to Cody A., Jim B., Pat H.L., Autumn R., Lydia N., Rod S., Eric C., Anita D.G., Cecilio T., Guille T., Yanita S. Lambu, and Daniel F. for your recent Facebook shares. Those shares are a simple way to help me get the word out. Christians can think too. Christians can think deeply about life from and in and through Christ. Thank you so much, you guys. Okay, before I go any further, I will make full disclosure. Today's episode, and quite likely several more to follow, significantly draws upon the social and historical insights of Shelby Steele. He's a black writer, a deep intellectual. Born in 1946, Shelby was 21 years old when he led a group of 27 black students into his then college president's office in 1967 to insist upon a list of demands those black students wanted from their university. Now, Shelby's own parents in the late 1950s and 60s had been active in helping blacks gain opportunities and rights in Chicago. His father, a truck driver, met Shelby's mother while they were both working for the Congress of Racial Equity, CORE. So, the whole family was involved in civil rights efforts. And it's not surprising that Shelby Jr. then became a long-standing civil rights leader. Steele earned a BA in political science, an MA in sociology, and a PhD in English. And I tell you all those academic credentials so that you'll understand he's not some bombastic rhetorician. He's no bomb thrower merely trying to sell books. No, he lived through the civil rights movement. He understood it. He helped to lead it from the inside. He grew up living in Chicago, understands American black culture, has published several books on race relations, multiculturalism, and affirmative action. My point for rehearsing all that biography? Shelby Steele is no hack. Honestly, in his book, White Guilt, How Blacks and Whites Together Destroyed the Promise of the Civil Rights Era, you guys, you simply must go buy a copy. He will plunge you deeply into the nuances of the civil unrest we're witnessing today. He wrote it clear back in 2006, but he might as well have been writing about 2020. It's amazingly prescient. He's able to see into the future from then to today. And in his book, he analyzed things for me in ways that textbooks on ethics had not framed things for me in my 15 years of full-time teaching. I mean, those textbooks burrowed down inside of different ethical dilemmas, but Steele's book is a historical study showing both the moral shift that America went through, but also why we are in the mess we are today. Shelby Steele's a man who lived through it all, boots on the ground. The book is excellent, true, beautiful, insightful. Pretty much every page had me stopping and thinking, I never saw it like that. Wow. And honestly, I'm not getting an honorarium from him for ardently promoting his book, White Guilt. It's just profound scholarship. And again, now, some 55 years later after the Civil Rights Movement, 55 years through which some 3 generations have had their hearts and minds reshaped, rewired by TV, cartoons, the educational system, and social media, we all crave to live among the cool kids. Man, your Adidas are so cool. More than ever, we want to be like the rest of the all. So, as we take that and apply it to this series, The Cult of the Now, Marxism in 2020, what does all that mean? What happened? Are you sitting down? Is your seatbelt fastened? Do I need to issue a trigger warning? Here's the big picture. America went from being a white racist, white supremacist country to being a white guilt, white shamed country. What the heck did you say, Ed? America went from being a white racist, supremacist country to being a white guilt, white shamed country. Now, I may explore some of the specifics of that history in later episodes. Today, I want you to understand the shift. I want you to understand how Marxist framing has driven the shift and how, honestly, how Marxist framing now owns the paradigm. And this is why we're seeing vandalism, looting, arson, shootings not only occurring, but being celebrated by professors, the media, pastors, and politicians, all on the progressive left, and all uniformly sympathetic to Marxist premises and framing. White guilt. Did America long have racist underpinnings? Well, geez, slavery certainly shouts yes. Were white people the dominant power brokers? Slavery and Jim Crow tell us yes. Was America only ugly, racist? No. America has offered the promise of freedom like no country on the planet. Does America have her sins of staining sins? Sure. Again, think slavery, Jim Crow. But did America fight a civil war to rectify that first massive sin? Indeed. Did America move through the civil rights movement and legally rectify huge chunks of that second national sin? Yep. Is America today, some 60 years after the civil rights movement, still mostly racist? I say no. I'll let you form your own perspective. But regardless of whether we agree together on that question, the singular truth remains. America is a nation suffering greatly under the sharp pangs of white guilt. That is Shelby Steele's thesis. Look, we all know what racism is. Treating others prejudicially for the color of their skin. Mistreating, abusing, violating someone on the basis of skin color. Racism runs contrary to God's character, contrary to the heart of Christ, and so it should be condemned, deservedly condemned. But arguably the most horrid quality of racism, it treats someone not as a person created imago Dei in the image of God, a person with his own biography, a person with their own unique giftings. Instead, racism treats that person exclusively as a member of his or her race. Racism. Ugly. But that's precisely what white guilt does. Treats an entire group as evil for its skin color. Me? A kid who grew up in the throes of the civil rights movement? We were taught often, regularly, carefully, loud and clear on just what racism is. I mean, all of that was part of the curriculum through my own education. Martin Luther King Jr. was held up to us as a champion. There will come a day when we will judge someone by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. Martin Luther King's pictures were in every classroom in my elementary school trajectory, and that makes total sense. America turned away from a past of legalized racism, laws that forced and celebrated segregation. We turned away from laws that kept minorities down while benefiting whites. All of that national turning was had, and it was necessary and good. And all of us now know what racism is. We all know what racism is. We know that whites were guilty of racism. Most of us do not, however, know what white guilt is. Think with me. History is, or human nature is, history is like a pendulum that swings back and forth. G.F.W. Hegel is, at the broad level, famous for making that analysis of history. It tends to swing from one extreme to the other, from one crisis to another. Instead of a crisis, a war, a pandemic merely correcting a prior problem, a prior power grab or governmental overreach, the pendulum tends to swing too far to correct things, and we end up with a new monster that looks a lot like the monster we all just fought to vanquish. The Who sang about this in their song, We Won't Get Fooled Again. Meet the new boss. He's same as the old boss. The historic pendulum swings too far too fast. Or, put more accurately, human nature tends to move from one mass hysteria to the next. And today, we've moved from white racism, America's legacy during its first 200 years, to white guilt, the sad legacy of the last 60 years. That's Shelby Steele saying that. The pendulum was indeed swung to correction. Civil War, Civil Rights Movement, affirmative action. The intent of all that was for tremendous freedom and opportunity for blacks and minorities. The aim of the government, the aim of our country, was that those crises, those tremendous national upheavals would put blacks and minorities on equal footing, equal opportunity, equal freedom to pursue dreams of excellence. But instead of all that, the pendulum kept swinging, and now we have white guilt. Oh, human nature, who will deliver us from this soma of corruption? The pendulum overcorrected, and instead of white racism, we now have white guilt. What is white guilt? Oh yes, I'm happy to oblige. Here's what white guilt means per Dr. Steele. Quote, the vacuum of moral authority that comes from simply knowing that one's race is associated with racism. End quote. And it works like this, quote, whites are told they must acknowledge historical racism to show themselves redeemed of it, but once they acknowledge it, They lose moral authority over everything having to do with race, equality, or social justice. End quote. That moral vacuum. Having to apologize, the history of race in America, having to apologize in the midst of that moral vacuum makes whites profoundly vulnerable today. My good listener, do you yourself feel vaguely unsure or guilty? Or did you ever sit in a college classroom, the professor ardently unpacking America's sins of racism, and you yourself felt guilty? White guilt. Even though you weren't alive when the nation was founded, do you feel guilty? White guilt. Pendulum overcorrection. Even though, like me, your own ancestors were not even in the United States until the early 20th century, but you feel opaquely guilty, nevertheless, white guilt. Pendulum overswing. Instead of 18th century slave owners feeling guilty, you, 160 years later, feel guilty. White guilt. Pendulum overcorrection. Instead of people who 200 years ago owned slaves in the South feeling guilty, you, who happen to live in the Pacific Northwest, are told you yourself are guilty for what happened centuries ago. You are complicit for your skin color. White guilt. Pendulum overswing. Instead of whites who championed segregations decades ago feeling guilty, you now feel vaguely guilty. That's called white guilt. It's pendulum overswing. And instead of merely studying the sins of the past to learn from them, you are told that you now need to own those past sins. That's white guilt. Instead of your pastor preaching from the Bible that each person is responsible for their own heart, he preaches that you are guilty for the invisible system, the inarticulate structure of racism that, air quotes, pervades all whites in America, end quotes. What is that? White guilt. And it's the moral vacuum, the moral empty space left behind by the sins of past racism that have been taken and used to create a mood, a climate, an educational system, a constant torrent of media pressure to make whites everywhere in the country feel guilty. White guilt. You guys, white guilt is now a cultural force. Cultures make us evaluate things. Cultures make us embrace or feel or reject all manner of elements in life. White guilt is now an entire culture. And it is striving, oh goodness, it's striving with all its might to become the dominant arbiter, the dominant arbiter, the dominant power. And guess, oh, just take a guess, where all of that has come from. Marxism, mostly. Why? Ask yourself, why? Why such a shotgun shame? Power. Why such a broad attack? Power. The Marxists want power. And if they can shut you up, shut me up, shut the churches up, force companies to bend their knee, silence the few voices courageous enough to say something, then they can have a kind of de facto, if not yet outright, power. What is de facto power? Well, it's not about a gun being pointed in your face. Well, not yet. It's not about physical force per se. It is about your own fear of saying on social media, yeah, but I wasn't a slave owner. Or your fear of asking aloud the question at church, didn't Jesus focus on people's hearts? Or your fear, the widespread fear of not virtue signaling on behalf of Marxist categories, de facto power. Your fear, apparently, given the public polls, your fear of openly asserting that you are a conservative Christian, it's quite Orwellian. If white guilt can control you through silence, then it will quickly step up to control your very thoughts. Right? We're seeing statues toppled and companies change their products' names and companies apologize for the ways, though those ways are never articulated. Oh my goodness, we we got an email from our local ski resort that we have a little hill above Boise called Bogus, and we have our emails there when we rent equipment. They sent us an email apologizing for what a racist company they've been. And we read that and wondered, how? How have you been racist? It's hardly ever, if never, articulated. It's likely, I believe very likely, that we will soon see indecent, according to the Marxists, we will see indecent books banned and burned. I mean, for goodness sake, the Broadway show Hamilton, featuring a cast full of minorities, the Broadway show Hamilton is being canceled by a culture of white guilt. Fear is de facto power. You think you aren't visibly complicit in the racist structures of America? How dare you, white guilt? You think you are not secretly, from the closet of your own home, involved in pressing down hard upon black folks by your mere existence? How dare you, white guilt? Man, it's Orwellian. It doesn't mean merely to shape your actions. It means to shape your thinking. Thought control. It's the ministry of truth. Oh, you haven't read George Orwell's 1984? You need to. In 1984, Orwell shows how incrementally the thought police storm in and rewrite history. Here's today's public school system. All of American history is one long racist story. Or the Ministry of Truth has the job of eliminating facts. That statue is ugly. It only reminds us of the past, vast system of racism. Never mind that the statue is of Ulysses S. Grant, who freed blacks, or of Abraham Lincoln, who led the Union against slavery, or some abolitionist. Tear that ugly statue down. It's Orwellian. It's historic rewrite. It is thought control. And it's not about reform. It's about revolution. And that's not me, the you saying that. That's what the Marxists openly assert. It's not about reform, it's about revolution. History is what we say it was. Cult of the now. The truth is what we say it is. Cult of the now. Virtuous thought is what we say it is. Cult of the now. This isn't about reform. It's about revolution. It's so weird to me. As the Babylon Bee pointed out satirically, today's Marxists think they are superior to America's slave-owning founders, that when Marxists today unilaterally support the abortion of 3,000 babies per day in the United States, 3,000 per day, and they're morally superior. Wild stuff. Baby lives don't matter. You cross our arbitrary lines and we'll cancel your social media account. Cult of the now. Oppose us and we'll burn down your mom and pop store. Cult of the now. Hey, Drew Brees, do you believe Black Lives Matter but you still support your local police? Careful, dude. The Ministry of Truth might show up and woke scold you. Careful New Orleans Saints Hall of Famer quarterback saying you're grateful for your local police. That violates the cult of the now. You can only say approved things. We will so cancel your advertising contract if you don't virtue signal your own obvious, secret, systemic racial guilt. Cult of the now. Orwellian stuff. Amazing. White guilt. Powerful formula. And it's in the air we breathe. It's sort of like a fish in an aquarium. When I was in college, I owned a blue fish, a Jack Dempsey. Actually, he was first my Mexican roommate Paul's fish. Paul had him first. But when Paul moved out, I inherited Jack. Jack was a 7-inch personality. He loved to attack your finger through the glass. Jack would sit in the corner of the aquarium as close as possible to me as he could while I sat there for hours studying. What Jack didn't know? The water passing through his gills every moment of his existence was rich with oxygen. That oxygen shaped his very existence. White guilt has invisibly but intentionally shaped the psychology of millions of whites who feel guilty but don't know why. White guilt, the result of a history pendulum overcorrection, causes millions of whites to live in shame even though they mostly could not articulate why they feel that shame. And again, it shows how powerful the cult of the now has been. Have they shaped you? Even without your knowing it? Have you been shaped by white guilt? Me, I reject Marxism because I reject its premises. Human beings are not merely matter. Our heart hungers for love and truth and goodness, elements that extend beyond material concerns. I reject that human beings are only motivated about power. Marxists may live that way. Most of the rest of us don't. Or human beings are not, first or foremost, the member of their entire race or class. I refuse to be told my own biography is meaningless in light of my birth. I won't accept that my unique gifts are insignificant because of the color of my skin. You can shout in my face that the hurdles in life I've overcome are the result of my class. Yeah. You weren't there for the 15 years of sacrifice that I put into my own education. I reject that this life is all there is. The universe is not the result of mere chance. There is a holy God who is our creator, savior, and judge. You see, Marxism promises equality, but it has never ever come through on that promise. It is always a worse monster than what it seeks to overthrow. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. Christians, don't be naive. Oh, goodness. 3 summers ago, I bought myself a pair of Adidas Superstars, the exact model that my 4th grade friend Tony wore 50 years ago. And guess what? They don't breathe very well. My socks are always damp after just a few hours of wearing them. Now it is true they look oh so snappy, but they don't even support my high-arched feet. And now I laugh at myself. Those Adidas just weren't all they were cracked up to be. I really wasn't deprived as a kid. The same thing's going to happen with culture and morality when truth takes its inevitable stance, because given time the truth always prevails, and people will and society will have all manner of epiphanies. Wow, personal responsibility really is necessary. We simply cannot judge someone's heart by the color of her skin. There's going to be an epiphany. It's just not fair to be prejudiced against him because his parents made a bunch of money. Realizations from the truth. White guilt must be rejected. It is a lie. Oh, beauty, 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 Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, Alpha and Omega of our souls. We confess you as Creator, Savior, and Judge. Thank you so much for listening, you guys, and please go and turn your beautiful God-given brains on, everybody.